Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dog Backwards, where we look at life, faith, and theology from a different angle. Today, we have New York Times best-selling author, I love saying that, John Burke. He wrote his new book's coming out soon, Imagine the God of Heaven. You might know him from his previous book, Imagine Heaven, where he talks about near-death experiences and things like that. John, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show, Caleb.
So this new book is kind of tricky. Like, it's interesting because it's like you lull people in with the near-death experiences, but what they're getting is a theology book. Was that your intention?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I was
No,
like, yeah.
yeah, really. What I was trying to do in Imagine Heaven, I actually came to faith um, as an agnostic, and I was an engineer, and I got my dad was dying of cancer. I read the first research on near-death experiences, and that opened me up, and I started to seek God and explore, and came to faith, and then ultimately left my career in engineering and became a pastor and a church planter like yourself. But for the last 35 years, I've studied thousands of near-death experiences. And what my interest has always been, it's kind of a compulsion. I think it's a
Right.
compulsion from God because I wanted to see how do we make sense of these? Because I became convinced that there's evidence enough to say this is something real and we should pay attention to it. And Christians typically were pushing it away. So I was trying to show in Imagine Heaven how if you look at a theology of heaven, of the afterlife, hell too, and then you look at the commonalities of what these people say, it lines up perfectly. It's amazing. Not that everybody always says things that line up perfectly. I'm not saying that. I'm
Yeah.
saying what overlaps in the commonalities. And in Imagine the God of Heaven, I'm writing about God. It's God's love story throughout history, from the beginning. He created us for relationship. We rejected that relationship. Genesis chapter 12, he makes a plan to bless all nations, right? That's his plan. And then you see Jesus come and offer a way for anyone from any nation to turn their heart back to God, be forgiven, be right with him. And Jesus said, tell this message to all the nations. Then Revelation chapter 7, you have John who sees in heaven all these nations, every tribe, tongue, every language represented there. And in Imagine the God of Heaven, I mean, it's amazing, Caleb, but God brought me stories from every continent and every religious background. And when they clinically die, and some for minutes, some for hours, and they're resuscitated, they are experiencing the same God. And I'm showing how this is the same God who's been revealing himself throughout history.
Now, I'm a skeptic by nature. Like, I believe very little of what I hear, even less of what I see. And
Yeah,
I had never given any thought to near-death experiences until Lee Strobel had a book come out last year,
the
the
case
Case
for
for
heaven.
Heaven, and he was on the podcast. I think he'll be on the podcast next week. And when I read, he had some stories about near-death experiences. Maybe it was just a chapter or so, but I was like, okay, so maybe there's some legitimacy to this. And I don't know how I had never come across your original book on this subject. But as somebody who's skeptical and goes, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but these people, they watch too many science fiction movies. It was the light
Yeah.
from the operating room. What are some of the things that like really convince you that you go, okay, this has real teeth to it?
Yeah, and I was the one that Lee interviewed in that chapter in
Yes,
the
right. I
case for
thought so.
heaven.
I thought so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So when I was still a skeptical engineer, here's some of the things, and I write in Imagine the God of Heaven in this new book, chapter 2. I put down the 10 points of evidence because there are always theories of what this stuff is. CNN just came out with a headline article: near death experiences in the brain even after death. Study shows. That's not what their article even said. It was just
Yeah.
clickbait headline. um, but what I'm showing is that these 10 points of evidence not only convince me, but convince many skeptical medical doctors as well. I mean, there have been 900 scholarly articles published on this in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Lancet, Psychiatry. The medical community is understanding this is something real. And that's why I'm excited about the Christian community realizing this is something we've got to speak into. So one of the evidentiary points is that when people die, they claim to leave their body, but they still have a spiritual body, just like Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, right? Which, by the way, I believe possibly Acts chapter 14, when Paul gets stoned to death and dragged out of the city, left for dead.
Yes. Yeah.
And then later in 2 Corinthians 12, he says, 14 years ago, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know, but I was taken up into the third heaven. I saw and heard things inexpressible. He might have had a near-death experience. That might have been that 14 years ago. And so when people leave their bodies, just like Paul said, our bodies buried a natural body, but it's raised a spiritual body, buried in weakness, raised in power, dunamis. And they say they're in this spiritual body, but often above and watching the resuscitation. Now that's important because when they come back, when they're resuscitated, they can many times describe what was happening during their resuscitation that they shouldn't have been able to see because their heart was not beating. They had no brain waves. And yet they somehow observed these things. I give one example in the chapter 1 of Imagine the God of Heaven was a woman in London who died giving birth, and she leaves and she goes into the presence of this God of light, who is love beyond anything, who says, you got to go back. Your son's going to live and he needs you. As she's coming back, she notices, so it sounds bizarre, I know. But when you hear after story and even studies done, she sees on the top side of the ceiling fan a red sticker and has writing on it. And she just noticed that. She comes back into her body and she's telling the nurses and doctors of this incredible experience, and no one believed her. Same thing, like, psychotic. And she finally got one nurse to listen to her when she told the nurse what she had said. And the nurse realized she couldn't have heard that. She shouldn't have heard that. And she said, I can prove it to you. Get a ladder and go up and look at the sticker on the top side of that ceiling fan. And here it's a red sticker and here's what it says. And she did. And sure enough, it was there. Now, that would be just one urban legend story,
Right.
Yet there are hundreds of them. And in fact, Dr. Janice Holden did a study on 93 patients who had cardiac arrest and claimed to have a near-death experience and make veridical observations. And what she found is 92% of their observations were completely accurate. Another 6%, each one may make multiple observations, were almost completely accurate. Only 2% were inaccurate. It was one patient, right, and that was inaccurate. So wow. Observations, that was a big one for me. But, just a few more of the 10 points. I won't go through all 10, but the second is common, consistent elements all over the globe. Mm-hmm. So you have people saying these common things that happen to them, and there are different depths of this experience, but they don't all happen to all people the same. Each is a little bit unique. So for instance, about 30% have a life review in the presence of this God of light and love. About 48% experience this God of light and love consistently. About 57% see relatives who had already died, and they meet them again on the other side. Now, my question is, if it's just a blip in the brain, like Dr. Michael Shermer says, why wouldn't every human brain have the same experience? Why would some have some aspects and others have other aspects, but why would they overlap all over the globe? In a court of law, If you have 10 eyewitnesses who say exactly the same thing, that's collusion. You
Right.
shouldn't trust them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have 10 eyewitnesses that say overlapping things, but each a little different from different perspectives, that's the strongest testimony. That's what we see with NDEs. Third one, that's a huge one for me, blind people who've been blind from birth. And I have multiple blind people, their stories, their testimonies in Imagine the God of Heaven. They can see when they clinically die. And like Debbie, who's in the book, she leaves her body, she sees, and it takes them a while to adjust, like this new thing called sight, or they don't even, it's perception, basically, visual perception. And she sees her mother come in, rush into the room and bend over her. And she's able to later say that she was wearing a robe and it was dark. And her mom said, yep, I was wearing a robe. It was black. And then she again travels into the presence of this God of light and love, who she never wants to leave his presence, but he says, you need to go back. You're going to have children. Well, she was told she could never have children, but she does end up having children. She also, on the other side, meets her grandmother, who she had never met before. Her grandmother had died when she was a child, a little baby. And she's able to accurately describe what her grandmother looked like. And her mother checked it out, but she said, but that's what she looked like when she was like 30, which is another commonality, which I'm personally excited about the older I get.
I do like 22, 30 was good, but if I could go a little bit younger, that'd be okay.
Yeah, maybe a 29, 25.
Yeah. Now, because we like to kind of on this podcast ask questions that maybe you haven't been asked before, because I know when you have a book coming out, you get kind of the same questions over and over again. So I was trying to think of what is a question that you might not have been asked before. Do you ever worry, or have you ever heard of people reading about this kind of stuff and then trying to recreate it in their own life so that they can go see heaven and then come back? Have you ever heard of any of that?
Oh, you mean like suicide?
People trying to stop. Well, people, there was a movie, I think it was, I can't remember what it was called, where people were intentionally stopping their heart. Flatliners. Yeah, that's the 1980s movie where people would try to stop their heart. And I feel like if we talk about this a lot, there's going to be some crazy person who's like, well, I want to see heaven, stop my heart, and then bring me back after so many minutes. Have you ever heard of anybody actually doing what they did in Flatliners?
Well, I have to say yes and no. So no, not for the purpose of trying to go see heaven. But yes, in the sense of there is a medical, I actually report her case in Imagine the God of Heaven because it's one of the most evidential cases, Pam Reynolds. And she had a deep brain aneurysm. So it's like way down here. They have to cut her head open and basically go deep into her brain. So in order to do that, they have to shut the whole body down. They lower the body to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, drain it of all blood. They put clickers, 100 decibel clickers in her ears and tape her eyes shut so that they can see that there's no brain waves. There's nothing she can't hear, she can't see, no brain waves. And an hour into that surgery, under the deepest anesthesia, Pam said she was above her body and could describe the saw they used to cut her open, which she said didn't look like a saw. It looked like my dad's electric, or it looked like an electric toothbrush with a really big cord. That's exactly what it is Midas Rex brain saw. And the socket set like her dad had that had all these bits in it. And then she goes again to this God of light and love. She's her grandmother is told she has to come back. And when she comes back, well, first she had also heard a doctor say, we can't find the artery. And the other doctor, the doctor who said that was a female, she said, the other doctor, male, up by her head said, try the other leg, which confused her because it was brain surgery. She was like, what's she doing down by my legs? Well, all that checked out. As she's coming back, they're playing Hotel California, and then they had to shock her twice. She's able to tell them about all these things during a 2-hour surgery under the most intense anesthesia with absolutely no brainwaves.
Now, one of the
So
things
to
that you
some
talk,
degree,
yeah,
that
yeah,
is kind of like the
yeah,
flatline scenario.
yeah. I mean, yeah, she
But by
didn't
the
wish it
way,
on herself, but yeah, go ahead.
well, it's kind of, I mean, most people don't come back. It's like a last chance
Yeah.
surgery because so many don't make it through that surgery. They don't come back.
Now, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, you talk about, you mentioned Hugh Ross in this chapter. Um, I was like, man, he's been on the podcast too.
Yeah.
I think we travel in
I
the
love
same
you. I
circles,
know
I
you.
guess. Yeah, dude, he's so smart, so
He is.
fascinating.
Yeah.
We had him on to talk about aliens, and I need to have him on again because that was one of my favorites.
Oh, wow.
Um, but talking about the way time works, that there was a two-dimensional timeline. How did you
Yeah.
describe that for me?
Yeah. So I talk about, and I think a lot of the mysteries about God, we're talking in this book about all the attributes of God and the mysteries of God, like the Trinity, like, trying to understand a little bit more. But also, you know, God's eternality. God is infinite, but God's also eternal. Well, what does that mean? And some of the things that are confusing to us actually resolve if you realize that we live in one-dimensional time. So our time goes in a line one way, one moment to the next. But in heaven, God's time has at least two, and I think three dimensions, but I think, he created time. So he exists outside of that, but he
Yeah,
can work in time. And he's working within 2 and 3 dimensional time. And I even quote indie ears who experienced this. But
yeah,
many talk about how they'll say things like time stopped or there was no time. Or others will say, well, there was time, but there was all the time you ever needed.
yeah,
Nothing was rushed. And we don't realize it, but in this life, time is our enemy, right? If it's a
hmm,
good moment, it passes too fast. If it's a bad moment, it doesn't pass fast enough. But two-dimensional time would mean that at each point on a timeline, there would be another timeline going perpendicular, if you can imagine that.
yeah.
So at each moment, I would have all the perpendicular time in the world to enjoy that moment before moving to another point on the one-dimensional timeline.
I
And
love
a
thinking
guy,
about things like that. Yeah,
and a guy, Greg Rickert, described that to me, like
yeah,
experiencing that. Of course, then God would be the alpha and the omega if he experienced three dimensions of time. So picture our one-dimensional time on a globe going around the equator, and then at each point of our time, there are longitudinal second dimensional timelines that
hmm,
go all the way up to then the North Pole, which is one singular point of
hmm,
time in 3 dimensions. And so if God's experiencing that one point of time of North Pole time, he's experiencing the beginning and the end and all points simultaneously.
yeah. When my kids always asking me, I have three boys, 10, 7, and 4. My oldest, he gets hung up on um, like what was there before God? How can God exist outside of time? And it's really hard for his brain. So we use like the example of a book. It's like, imagine time is this book. God can open it to the beginning, the middle, or the end anytime he wants because he's the one who created it. But I had
Mm-hmm.
never thought of like if we're moving forward in time and you're having a great day, you could pause moving forward and then go up in time to where you're going to spend like you're just hanging out in that moment, but yet in a sense, time is still progressing. That's a fascinating thing to think about, and Hugh Ross does a little bit of the science on that, which is beyond my understanding.
Yeah.
But that I think that leads us also to we have a very similar way I think of explaining the Trinity in the Flatland. I always use like the Garfield comic strip.
Oh,
And if I have a pen, and I said, if I was to put this pen into Garfield's world, all he would see is the tip. Or if I
right.
turn it around and I put this, he sees the circle. There would be this circle that entered into his universe because he's in flat. I'm in 3 dimension. And
Right.
then I could lay the pen down and he would see this big long line across the sky. And like now try imagine telling Garfield that that point, the circle, and the line are all the same thing. It would be
Right.
so hard for his mind to grasp. And you do the same thing kind of with fingers,
Right.
that it's one hand, but as they enter in. So
Yeah,
I
and
yeah.
it's in the chapter on the triune God, the mystery of the triune God. And I have a, a Jewish girl who always prayed to God, who, when her horse crushes her, Jesus is there with her. And the only thing she'd heard about Jesus is every night her dad had a mantra, your life is worthless. There is no God. Jesus is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind.
Mm-hmm.
And yet she always prayed to God. It was a pretty abusive home. And so
Yeah, sounds
she
like it.
prayed to God and took consolation in her faith in God and believed he was there with her, felt like he was there with her, comforting her every night when she went to bed. Well, then in her near death experience, here's Jesus. She knows he's Jesus. And she said, I wasn't thinking like, what's a nice Jewish girl like me doing with Jesus? I'm not supposed to be with
Yeah.
Jesus. She said, no, I knew him. This was the God I had always prayed to. And he shows her a life review, which is another commonality. And in her life review, she sees that he's the one sitting by her bed when she's praying as a little girl.
Mm-hmm.
Then he takes her to the Father, and she describes being there with God the Father and how it was like being in the presence of your dad who's hugging you and you never ever want to leave. She said, but he was also Jesus, but Jesus was also separate. And then she says, I can't tell you how God can be light and God can be love and God can be a man, yet one. I can't explain it, but that's what I experienced.
Yeah.
And I have multiple people saying things like that, like who should not have had, they had no background or understanding
Yeah.
of a triune God, and yet they're saying that's who they experienced. The other thing that's fascinating is how many of them say in heaven, how can three be one, which is our,
Mm-hmm.
that's a contradiction in our, in our three finite,
Right.
dimensions of space. But in heaven, they say it's not even a question.
Mm.
God is one
Yeah.
as Father, Son, and Spirit.
Yeah.
And I knew when I was talking to the Father, I was also talking to Jesus. I was also talking to the Holy Spirit. You can't separate them. They're
Right.
one, but they're also three.
Because
So
yeah, when you add that other dimension, like if you go from flatland to our world, you add one dimension, things get complicated really quickly. And
well,
like string theory says that there could be up to 13 dimensions in this world. We know the Bible says
yeah,
there's at least a spiritual dimension. And so all you have to do is add one dimension and it goes, yeah, my mind can quite easily grasp that. And I
yeah,
loved how you even do a little bit of the Trinity in the Old Testament. You talk about the
right.
angel of the Lord. We have an apologetic conference at our church Saturday, and I'm
Mm,
teaching on the Trinity in the Old Testament. And it was the two powers in heaven was a very common way to talk about God until 100 years after the resurrection, when it started to sound too much like Christianity, and they basically did away with it. So I was
yeah.
really glad to hear that you bring that in. I want to get to maybe one or two more questions before we run out of time. Um, I'm curious to hear about maybe somebody who has almost no understanding of the Christian God at all. Maybe they're a Buddhist, maybe they're from some third world country.
Hmm.
Uh, do they see a God of love and light, or do they see a God of anger and wrath? And uh, just
No,
kind of
here's
walk
the
me through
thing.
some of that.
Yeah, I have 70 near death experience accounts in Imagine the God of Heaven, and they're from every imaginable background. And you can read for yourself what they're seeing, and you can see that they are experiencing the same God. And he's not always the God they anticipated. Um, and that is true from Dr. Bell Chung, who's a PhD in Hong Kong. I quote a girl who is communist in China, uh, Bibi in Tehran, a Rwandan imam who died and said into this room, rescue comes as a rescuer Jesus, but he was full of light. And he held out his hands, and there were big holes in his hands. And that's how I knew who he was. And he said, I died for mankind. You are among those I died for. Never deny it and tell everyone.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So yes, I mean, I don't see how people can read this and not just be in awe of the evidence God has given of his reality, but also I hope it breaks our boxes that we've put God in, because we're finite. So we do.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I appreciate is it's easy for people to get obsessed about just the near-death experience stuff. But what you're really trying to do is you want to imagine the God of heaven and not just heaven. Like it's
about God.
It's about God. That's what makes heaven heaven.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, Caleb, that's exactly right. You know, the reason I wrote this, I actually quit writing after Imagine Heaven 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the Lord pretty clearly said, no, I want you to write again. And I want you to write about me. And it was really easy because of all the people I've interviewed, they so commonly said, you know, of all the beauty of heaven, it's beautiful. It's way more beautiful than earth, though not unlike earth. Of all the glorious reunions with family members, they would say nothing compared to just being with God. Nothing.
Yeah.
And that's why the subtitle is The Love You've Always Wanted, because that's commonly what they said, is that he really is who we long for.
Right. I had some Mormon missionaries stop by the house the other day, and we were talking about their 3 levels of heaven. And they think that if I die, I go to heaven, but God's not there because he's only at the highest level where they can reach exaltation. I said, well, then that would be hell. I was like, any kind of afterlife without God is hell. This book comes out November 7th. John, thank you so much. They can find it on Amazon. They can Google your name, find it on your personal bookstore, wherever books are sold. But I want to encourage you, go get it, because you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the best of the near-death experience stories, but also really good theology. And it almost seems like part of it is kind of written for maybe some non-believers. So if you have some non-believer friends, this teaches them a lot about what we as Christians believe. Thank you so much for coming on, and good luck on the new book. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Caleb. Appreciate it. See ya.
Take care.